Well, good morning everybody and welcome to the SAUG Summit. And we're doing a series of interviews here this morning. As you get your coffee, and you're probably wandering around looking at these screens saying, what on earth's going on? Well, I'm going to be interviewing a number of people today, and my guest today is Glenn Wightwick, who's the Chief Technologist at IBM Australia. But before I introduce Glenn, just a reminder that all of these interviews we'll be doing here today will be on SAUG TV, so you can log into the website and have a look at them all later. So a number of things that we'll be covering off today, and one of the first things that we're going to talk about today is this concept of innovation. Innovation's a theme at the conference here today, and it's been talked about in the first session. So Glenn, can I just ask you first, innovation, what does that mean to you? You're almost like the chief innovator at IBM, if I could say that.
Thanks, Mark. It's a good term, that innovation. I think it's one that we use a lot, but I think it's really the concept of exploring new areas, driving new ideas. It's not just about things like invention, it's not just about technology. In my view, it's actually the application of that stuff, those sorts of concepts to do things in a new and novel way.
Now, just to cover off a few things, you're going to be talking about IBM Smarter Planet here just after the break. What are the main areas you think where you're seeing interesting areas of innovation, technology ideas that you're working on?
I guess from a perspective of Smarter Planet, which is something we've been articulating for quite some time now, we're really seeing that leading us into whole new different domains. We're working in areas that we would probably never have conceived of 5 or 10 years ago. Some of those are in what I kind of call natural systems, so things like rivers and the natural environment, trying to improve the efficiency of that through the application of technology, but also systems that are complex systems, the man-made systems, like a supply chain, transport network work, or even an entire city. And you can think of a city as kind of a system of systems. And we want to not just understand how they work, but figure out how we can improve their efficiency. And underpinning that is a whole lot of interesting computational problems, interesting research problems, interesting modeling, simulation problems.
So data warehousing or business intelligence, data analytics, those have got to be some pretty interesting areas that you're looking at in the labs? Yeah,
absolutely. And they're kind of key building blocks, if you like, to understand how the world works. So as I'll talk about in my presentation in a few minutes, we kind of have this notion that the world is becoming very highly instrumented, and we can demonstrate that. We can show our mobile phones, we can talk about instrumentation that's put out into the environment, but making sense of bazillions of tons of information that's arriving from all those instruments requires those sorts of techniques that you talked about before, but it also kind of requires them in real time. And in the past, in the IT world, we might have thought about loading transactions into a data warehouse and doing analysis overnight and looking at some sort of sales metrics or whatever. Today we want to actually get information in real time and make sense of it in real time, and that's a really challenging problem, and that's where we're putting a lot of our energy in terms of research investment into.
Well, in many ways this is the same old big integration problem, isn't it? We were just looking at that really cool demo on stage with the iPad and looking at the SAP business intelligence platform and how you can really do that. In order to get to that level of simplicity, there's actually a very complex back end, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely, and I thought that demonstration was fantastic. There's no question that computing devices, that the iPad and the iPhone and other intelligence and mobile devices represent how people are and will continually interact with information. They want it at their fingertips wherever they happen to be, whether that be in an airport, whether that be in the country, whether that be at home or wherever. And as you say, behind the scenes, you have to do an enormous amount of work to aggregate that information together, make it available and accessible in real time. When Tim was doing our demonstration, none of us would have been prepared to sit for a minute or two to have some report running in the background. All of that information that he was zipping and collecting needed to be available in real time. So I think SAP have kind of got the right thinking here, and it's very aligned with the way we're looking at dealing with information, aggregating it, presenting it, modeling it, and processing it in real time.
Well, in some cases, the latency that we're looking at isn't maybe in the databases, it's actually in the network. So how fast is the 3G network or the Wi-Fi that you're over, right?
Right, and there's a whole area of discussion as to the capability of networks to deal with that. And clearly people are having expectation, no matter where they are, that they can get access to sufficiently fast, high bandwidth, low latency networks. The other thing that's kind of important in all of this, and continues to be very, very important, is security. Because underpinning all of that is appropriate access management, authentication, encryption of data from the source, and particularly as we're evolving to these sort of cloud computing models, where it becomes very easy to use and get access to that information, but you want to know that it's stored securely somewhere and have all the appropriate governance around that.
And that's a good point. I should ask you, one of the themes that we're sort of looking at here, particularly in the development of the SAP platform, is this hybrid model. We've got traditional on-premise, but also this growing emergence of cloud. Now, some CIOs are excited about that and others are not so excited about that. How do you see the enterprise evolving from that hybrid perspective?
So it's a good question. Some of the public cloud systems have obviously present a very kind of compelling use case of how people can access cloud computing. But the reality is, of course, that there are a lot of times there are various different constraints which require companies to think very carefully about how they'll do their computing. And there's sometimes legal, there's laws that prevent data from being hosted outside Australia. There are existing applications that don't necessarily lend themselves to be located in the cloud, and that of course leads to this concept of a hybrid cloud model, which I think is the reality. Most people are going to start looking at particular workloads and realise that they can very effectively lower their costs and improve capability by exploiting cloud computing. So we'll see transition of certain workloads into the cloud, and it'll probably vary by organisation. If I was in a new company and I was starting up my own business, I would probably today think about doing as much of it as I could in the cloud, as possible. However, if I was in a different industry where there were particular constraints and regulations, I might think carefully about the implications of those workloads that I should move into a cloud and those that I should keep. And of course you then need to manage again this concept of security, and when a new employee joins your organisation or when they leave, how do you make sure that their data that's in the cloud somewhere is appropriately managed and removed from the systems and things like that.
It seems that there's this very clear distinction between private clouds and public clouds. I know that you and I have talked about that before in the past. We're sort of talking about private clouds here, aren't we? And I wonder whether we need to sort of think more, have more focus on that as a private cloud. So if, for example, you're migrating your data center, it would be stored, all your data is stored by IBM or some other outsourced provider. That's a private cloud, isn't it? Is that the best way to think of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that cloud computing has done very successfully is driven some thinking about the style of computing. There's nothing, if you look underneath the covers, there's nothing technically new in cloud computing, but there are some characteristics which are very, very important. That sort of elasticity to be able to increase the computing facilities according to the workload, to be able to self-provision, to have appropriate access of that through a browser and not need heavyweight clients and things like that. Are some of the very attractive attributes. So people are obviously looking at, well, how can I take my existing infrastructure, and maybe it's not appropriate for me to move that into a public cloud or into some sort of hybrid cloud, but I still want to take advantage of what cloud computing offers. Yeah. And so, people have been very aggressively driving virtualization, and that's one of the things we've been doing for a long period of time, because once that virtualization layer is sort of introduced at the storage, at the computing, at the network level, you get some of the flexibility that the cloud computing has to offer. And there are a number of good examples where people have built private clouds, getting some of the significant value out of that cloud computing model.
Well, just in closing, give me a few tips. What do you think CIOs and enterprise architects should be thinking about from a software layer perspective? You're sort of planning the future of where you're going to take your software architecture into the cloud, into this sort of hybrid model.
There's no doubt, I think, that cloud computing is something that's practically on most CIOs' minds. And so thinking about how to migrate from an existing environment to a cloud computing environment, whether that be public, private, or some sort of hybrid, is clearly something that people are thinking about, and a lot of investment in terms of virtualization and so on to enable that. I think also, as we look forward, we need to be thinking about the application space and what applications we want to be using that are going to work in a cloud environment. And I think there's also an important set of considerations around sort of emerging standards for cloud computing. because like everything else in the IT industry, things work best when there's a set of open standards that enable people to move from one environment to the other. So that's one area. The other area I think that CIOs are looking at is, and it comes back to some of this thinking around Smarter Planet, which is just this whole question of data analytics and optimization, being able to ingest and deal with very, very large volumes of information from a myriad of sources and turn that into useful information in real time. You know, that's a big challenge. We've got some capability there, and I think that's another area that CIOs are looking at the moment.
And of course the big question is, how can you do that in an efficient way? Because clearly integration projects are always big.
Right, and you know, integration of course continues to be a large challenge. You know, we see many times where projects aren't as successful as they should be because of a lack of understanding, lack of governance, and challenges in integration. And again, you know, I think that things like standards are really important, as is, you know, robust, you know, having really good architects that understand, can build an enterprise architecture view and drive down to all of the appropriate components underneath.
Well, Glenn, thanks for having a chat with me this morning here at the SAUG Summit, and good luck with the presentation that's coming up in a few moments.
Thank you, Mark.
Cheers. Thank you.